Okay, so this is the first video for Unit 8. Unit 8 used to be two separate units, the Psychological Disorders Unit and then the Treatment of Psychological Disorders Unit. But we have now clumped them into one unit, which is Clinical Psychology. It makes more sense that way, I think. But before we can really get into talking about the different disorders as well as their treatments, we have to talk about the history of psychological disorders as well as the different perspectives on how these disorders come to be. And then a little bit about how we classify these disorders and how we determine whether or not someone has a disorder or if it's just normal behavior. So why is it important for us to learn about this? Well, because it's extremely prevalent within our society. Approximately 1 in 5 adults in the US, which is 43.8 million people, experience a mental illness in a given year. And then approximately 1 in 25 adults in the US, or 9.8 million people, experience a serious mental illness that interferes with one or more of their major life activities. This is a big deal, meaning that a lot of people are experiencing mental illness. And so it's important for us to really understand what these disorders are so that we can break the stigma of mental illness. And this is not just a United States problem, right? Disorders like depression and schizophrenia exist all over the world. So this information is important for us to have. So what is abnormal behavior? How do we classify something that is abnormal versus normal? Why is it important for us to define this? Haven't we all behaved abnormally, right? So what makes this abnormal behavior that we've all done something that's an issue enough for us to be detained or to be treated, right? Who determines that line that we need to cross to move from abnormal behavior to now a disorder? So the American Psychiatric Association, or the APA, states in the dsm-v, which we will talk about in a little bit, the following criteria for labeling a behavior as disordered. First, the behavior, a behavioral or psychological syndrome or pattern that occurs in an individual that must reflect an underlying psychobiological dysfunction, meaning that the brain is not working properly. There's a pattern of dysfunctional behavior. So that's the dysfunction part of it. The next is the consequences of these behaviors are clinically significant distress or disability, meaning that there's either a painful symptom or an impairment in one or more areas of dysfunction. This is the distress piece. And then the response cannot be something that's a common response to a stressor or a loss, and it can't be a culturally sanctioned response, meaning some sort of religious ritual. What this has to be, in order for a behavior to be disordered, it has to be a behavior that is a result of social deviance or conflicts with society. Okay, so the behavior has to be deviant. Now, we think of the word deviant and it has kind of this connotation of being, bad, right? But deviant just means different from what is normal in society. And so the reaction to a stressor or to a loss needs to be different from whatever society would normally do, okay? So there's 4 D's that you need to know and a U that are important when labeling a behavior as disordered. First, like I said, is deviant. It goes against the norm of behavior. It could be abnormal in one culture, though, and normal in another, but we are looking at the environment that that person is currently in, okay? The next is distressful. The behavior must cause the person or other people around them distress, meaning it disturbs them or it causes them some sort of pain or discomfort or anxiety. The behavior must be dysfunctional, meaning that it is altering their daily life or interfering with their ability to go about their daily life. And then it could also be dangerous, where they're causing harm to themselves or others. And then finally, the 5th one is unjustifiable, meaning that the behavior is illogical or irrational. It doesn't really make sense. Okay, so these are the things that we look for when we are looking at someone's behavior and determining whether or not it is a abnormal behavior. So let's talk about the history of psychological disorders. Ancient treatments of psychological disorders include trephination, exorcism, and being caged like animals, beaten, burned, castrated, mutilated, and transfused. Basically because they believed that these abnormal behaviors were the result of evil forces within the person's body. So whether those be demons or some sort of evil living within that person, they had to remove that evil out of the person. Okay, and so one of the ways was trephination, which you can see here, in which they drilled holes into the skull so that the evil forces could come out of the top of the head. Obviously, this is not what we do anymore. We don't believe this anymore, but this was the ancient forms of psychological treatment. Then, around 1745, 1726, or between these times, Philippe Pinel from France insisted that the madness or the abnormal behavior was not due to demonic possession, but in fact, an ailment of the mind. Something was wrong with the mind. And so this brought us to the medical model. And what this did is it looked at mental illness as as the symptoms of the mental illness, and then cured through therapy. So we're looking at this more as a medical problem rather than a demonic or a spiritual problem. So we've moved away from spiritual and now moving into the medical model where we're going to treat it with therapy as well as potentially living in a psychiatric hospital. Today, we normally look at psychological disorders along the lines of the biopsychosocial approach, just like we've done in everything else in psychology this year. Basically, what this is saying is that there are biological, sociocultural, and psychological factors that all combine to interact to produce these psychological disorders. We cannot have one without the other. Okay, so evolution, our genes, our brain structure all interact with our stress and trauma that we have experienced, that interact with the expectations and the roles of society, and then the definition of what is normal. So this is what we now believe, that psychological disorders come from all of these different experiences and approaches. But we're going to look at each of the perspectives on clinical psychology to kind of see how they view the different disorders. So we're going to think back, way back to Unit 1 when we talked about the different perspectives. The first, which we talked a lot about in our personality unit just a little bit ago, was the psychoanalytic approach. And the STEM word here was childhood, right? So psychoanalytic believes that psychological disorders stem from those unresolved childhood conflicts, meaning that in order to understand the roots of a disorder, we have to look at someone's early life. We have to see what they went through when they were a child in order to determine why they're experiencing what they're experiencing now. The next is the behavioral, the buzzword here being learning, right? So behavioral approach believes that our behaviors are learned responses. So in order for us to understand a disorder and why it came to be, we need to analyze how that behavior was learned and then what reinforces that behavior to continue. So think about this in terms of fears or phobias. Why did someone develop this phobia, and then what is reinforcing that phobia to continue? Next is the cognitive approach. Thinking, right? That's the cognitive approach. And it believes that our thoughts and beliefs are the root of our psychological problems. So if we have a psychological disorder, the only way to fix that disorder is to fix the thoughts and beliefs, or change the thoughts and beliefs that a person has, and then that behavior will change. The next is the humanistic approach. This is our hippie approach, right? In self-worth and all of that. So they believe that people are responsible for their own behavior, even their abnormal behavior. And they focus on the relationship between the individuals and society and how people view themselves in relation to others. So they believe that someone who has a disorder They don't have great self-worth, and they have a lot of conditions of worth placed upon them, and therefore their disorder comes from not meeting those standards that society sets for them. And then finally, our sociocultural approach believes that abnormal behavior is shaped by family, society, and culture. And when we talk about family, we're not talking about the genes, right? That's the biological approach. We're talking about the environment in which you grow up. So your family environment, society, and culture. And what this one is saying is that our relationships with others can support and even cause abnormal behaviors. It stresses that when one encounters in life can influence the disorders they have or don't have. So a person's family may push a person to have a psychological disorder.